I'm very excited to be joined by Professor Stephen Holgate, who is MRC Clinical Professor of Immunopharmacology at the University of Southampton. He is also the UKRI Clean Air Champion and Special Advisor to the Royal College of Physicians on air quality. And he's going to be talking to us more about the respiratory health impacts of PM2.5. Without further ado, over to you, Stephen.
Good. Thank you very much, Larissa, and hello, everybody. So my career has been spent in lung disease, and hence the topic of my talk today. Could I have the first slide, please? So the lung, as you all know, is a very complicated organ, shown on the left here in 3 dimensions, with 23 branching generations of airways, ending up with the little air sacs at the end, shown on the right-hand side, called alveoli, where oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged in the process of breathing. And of course, COVID-19 shone a light on the lung when this part of the lung was severely damaged by that virus infection. And of course, we've become very much more interested in it ever since that time. Next slide, please. So let's just have a little summary about breathing for a moment. We take about 17 to 30,000 breaths every day. The average adult breathes about 10,000 litres of air every single day to get oxygen in and carbon dioxide out of their bodies. And in every single breath, depending where you're living, we take between 5 and 50 million very small particles into our lungs, which are suspended in the air. And of course, it's these particles, which are not only pollutant particles, but also viruses and bacteria and pollen grains and all sorts of other things. These are the things that in the environment set up some of the diseases that are linked to chronic lung disease. And the sad thing about chronic lung disease is that it tends not to shout like some organs do through pain or through redness or through various other appearances. These lung diseases quietly erode the lung until often, in the case of very chronic lung disease, it's too late by the time we understand that there's been a problem. Next slide, please. So let's just talk about these particles that Larissa referred to. This is a human hair, and you can see the particles are sometimes referred to as PM, particulate matter. And the number after them, 10 and 2.5 or 0.1, relates to the diameter of the particle in question. And you'll see that air pollution particles that we're talking about, the ones that get deep into the lung, are either 2.5 or less mass median diameter. And the very small ones, the ultrafine particles, are sometimes referred to as PM 0.1. In other words, 0.1 micrometers in mass median diameter. Next slide, please. So this picture came from one of Mark Miller's publications, and he's speaking next, just to demonstrate what happens when these very small particles reach the airways and then the terminal air sacs, and you'll see that they pass through the liquid lining the air sacs and then eventually the epithelium and traverse then the circulation. And of course, once these particles get into the circulation, they go to all parts of the human body, as you can see by this very helpful illustration that Mark has created. Next slide, please. So how about the effects? How does air pollution particles cause disease? Well, there's been a lot of research in the last decade or so highlighting how air pollution particles, when taken in, can set up a series of reactions in the lung that damage the lining cells, not only of the conducting airways, the 23 generations, but also the air sacs at the end, the little alveoli. And they do this by the chemicals that these particles are obviously carrying with them, plus the injurious effect of the particle itself once it passes into these lining epithelial cells. And what happens there is that chemical reactions occur which generate tissue-damaging chemicals called reactive oxygen intermediates. And this causes something that we often name as oxidative stress. And by that, this is the chemical substances generated by these reactions damage the cellular functioning of the cells that the particles are interfacing with. And as you can see on the right-hand side, these are the epithelial cells. And of course, if the particles pass through that epithelium into the circulation, they go into the circulating cells. And here again, they activate the reactive oxygen pathways, causing some abnormal function of those cells. And then eventually, if they reach the very periphery of the human body, whether it's the liver, the brain, the heart, wherever, then these particles will create the same sort of inflammatory reactions out in the periphery as they do in the lung. And this is why we often now refer to particulate air pollution as a systemic problem rather than just a local lung problem. And Mark will talk more about that in a minute. Next slide, please. So this has all come bubbling to the surface, I suppose, relatively recently in the last 10 to 12 years. These are some pictures relating to North America, and of course the forest fires there, particularly in California, are very much in the headlines at the moment. This just shows an example, not of the acute effect of forest fires, but the chronic effects on diseases like heart attacks and chronic obstructive lung disease and chronic asthma. It shows you that between 2008 and 2018, there's been a progressive increase in number of these fires. And you can see in that middle panel there on the right that Northern California forests have been particularly affected. But the bottom of that California map, you'll see at the left-hand side, the area that's currently very much in the news, Southern California and Los Angeles. And studies before this nasty recent outbreak of fires have already established quite clearly that particulate pollution from wood burning is more damaging to the lung than any other form of particulate pollution that we encounter on a regular basis. Next slide, please. Well, this is the current news, of course, in Los Angeles. And of course, these people are being affected by the acute effects of pollution, not only on their properties, but by inhaling the terrible smoke around in that location. But in the long term, these people will be also harvesting, unfortunately, the long-term effects of breathing in these nasty, toxic particulate pollutants and will lead to an increase in cardiac and other diseases. So wood burning in this setting, which is obviously wild wood burning, is a real problem, which is on the increase. And it's on the increase, of course, because of the changes we associate with climate change, as you can see in the bottom of this slide here. Next slide, please. So let's get closer to home now. Of course, we do have our heathland fires, and last year we had a good number of them. But the big issue we're dealing with currently is burning biomass, particularly wood, in our urban environments. And wood burning is a major source of PM2.5, not only in the forest fires and in the fires that we see in our nature reserves, but also in our local urban settings. And you can see on the left-hand side, the issue here, houses close together, some burning fossil fuels in their fire grates, as you can see on the right-hand side, or even burning them in the gardens. And this smoke, which is very much involved in kind of perpetrating, I suppose, the local community. Number 20, if you could put that up there, please, slide 20. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. No, the previous one, please. That's it. There we go. The reason why this is important, this domestic burning, is because the intake fraction, that is the proportion I don't know what's happening here. The intake fraction, the proportion of the particulates that we are taking in this urban setting is much higher than the average particle smoke contribution that we are having measured by DEFRA and other air quality measuring units around the country. In other words, it's pockets of air pollution like this that are causing the real problem. And therefore, it's the pockets of air pollution that we're missing by national monitoring of air pollution, even though, next slide, please, we recognise that in London, for example, just taking the average air pollution particles, wood burning is now up to 17% of the total particulate pollution that Londoners are breathing in. But that'll be much higher in some localities where they're burning wood in domestic burning stoves in localities around London and around our other urban settings. And you'll see how much that has increased from 2010 to 2020 and continues to increase because this is a fashionable thing now. This wanting to have domestic wood burning stoves in our living spaces to give us that warm feeling. And as a result of that, this is the contribution that we're witnessing in the urban setting. And you'll see that in areas like London, but now outside London, wood burning exceeds the air pollution of road traffic. And finally, if I could go to the next slide, please. Looking at
Stephen, sorry, Larissa, just to say it'd be good to start to wrap up so we can
thank you.
not run out of time.
Just start to look at the lung effects. These are the particles I was talking about previously. In the next slide, please. These are the lung effects. They'll be familiar to you all: inflammation, infection, reduced lung function, and more recently recognized, really quite an uncomfortable increase in lung cancer among non-smokers. Thank you very much, Larissa.